everyone. Welcome to 2020 Design Trends by UXPin. Today on our interview, I'm joined by Lee. Lee, please tell us a bit about yourself, introduce yourself, tell us a bit about your experience, where you work, and just, like introduction.
Sure. Kat, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here on UXPin. So my name is Lee Sean Huang. I am a designer based in New York City, and I split my time sort of three ways between my own practice at a service design firm I started called FUSA, and I'm also an educator. So I teach part-time at the School of Visual Arts here in New York, as well as at New York University and the Parsons School of Design. And then I'm also involved in the design community. I work with AIGA, which is the Professional Association for Design here in the US. And I'm involved with the design podcast with AIGA and also supporting our community of design educators.
Thank you very much. So because I knew that you are in design education, I would like to ask you about, like trends for design education.
Yeah, sure. Happy to talk about it. I mean, I think we're talking about the next year coming up, but just to give a little bit of like broader context, specific tools and technologies are changing all the time. I finished grad school myself 10 years ago, and a lot of the things I learned are obsolete. I actually used to teach like Flash animation and action script like 5-6 years ago, and now I like barely remember any of that stuff. It's like I never learned it at all, and it seems like ancient history, right? And I think there's still a lot of basic fundamentals that are unchanged, that are still the backbone of the web and mobile and things like that. So I teach an intro class at New York University in web design, introduction and fundamentals. So it's still basic HTML, CSS, stuff like that, especially for beginners, is not really going to change that much. But in terms of trends, I think more and more we're seeing this convergence, right, of designers going over to the coding side, but also with design systems, we have more and more engineers who are essentially doing the work of design, even if these systems have been created by designers. So I guess the sort of simple answer would be this kind of convergence in the middle, right? And I think we're still trying to figure out, in terms of in organizations, in teams, politically, how we deal with roles, because the tools themselves have become more democratic kind of in both ways.
Yeah, gotcha. Well, I've had like a lot of discussions about the landscape of like jobs in design, and some people say that, well, there's no like UX designer job is like disappearing or something, or some new roles are going to be appearing on the stage. What are your views on that?
Yeah, I think UX as a job title and as a field is really broad and expansive. I don't know exactly about the data to see if UX jobs are really disappearing or not, but I do see, just anecdotally, more and more designers working as and being identified as product designers, for example, right? And I think product design certainly involves UX, but maybe is also has more responsibility, say, on the business model side of things, as well as other parts of that. But I think we see two things, right? One is like hyper specialization, but also the need for generalists. So the fundamentals that you get as a generalist in UX or product design is really looking at the whole scope of complexity of software products today and tech products today. But there's also hyper specialization, as I mentioned in my previous answer, where the tech is moving so quickly that you also see a lot of jobs, especially maybe more entry level or specialists, that are looking for very specific software programs, very specific frameworks, for example. So you kind of see a little bit of both, but I think as the more senior you get as a designer, there are demands to be more of a UX or a product specialist, whatever that job title might be. Or sorry, to be more of a generalist, I'm sorry, whatever that title might be.
Yeah, sure. Well, I like it that you said that your approach to education is changing with with time. And of course, like, there are some basics that we all have to know, like, as or designers have to know, but there are new things just popping around like all the time, right? And
Sure.
we have like a vision maybe of how the generation alpha is going to change the design, the approach to products, or just general world.
Yeah, I mean, I think Generation Alpha is still definitely still coming up in the world. So um, I think from my perspective, just looking at my nieces and nephews, right, and my nephew in particular, who's only 3.5, 4 years old, but growing up in, I don't really like this term digital native, but just the fact that he has been able to figure out an iPad by himself, right, and like watch YouTube videos, and this expectation of that all screens are touch screens. At what point will we flip over where like a TV where you can't touch the screen is going to seem weird, right? Just as how we used to, I'm old enough to have like had a landline phone, right? And that was a phone. And now like a landline is kind of weird and old fashioned. Like we have this mobile first kind of mindset. So I think with Generation Alpha, there's going to be certain things that are just defaults for them, right? In terms of touch screens or even voice interfaces, right? Talking to your Siri or Alexa, whatever that is. But also, I mean, I think this is more with Gen Z, but I see this with my undergraduate students where I introduce them to things like command line or even things like file paths, and things like that are kind of a struggle for them because they've grown up with GUIs, right? These graphical user interfaces. They've grown up with being able to search for anything. So this idea of like structured paths or command line stuff is not so natural for them because they have to kind of go back and learn it. Whereas for me, starting with DOS, with my first computer, it's something I grew up with, not something that I have to kind of learn as like an old technology. So I think the starting points are different, but there's trade-offs there.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I just get so nostalgic when you say DOS, or like, if envision Mario Bros, etc. But there is this strong trend, I guess, of like vintage stuff and retro stuff. Do you think that's going to be like something for 2020 as well?
Definitely. I mean, I think we're already seeing stuff like that. I had this realization, right, as we got into 2020, that the 1990s were like, 20, almost 30 years ago, if you look at the early 90s. And it's kind of the same perspective as being a teenager in the 1990s, thinking about the 70s, right? There was kind of the 70s retro revival in the 90s. And I think that's the equivalent. And I see this not just with the design aesthetic, right? Certainly we see these GeoCities inspired sites, or the Captain Marvel movie website had this 1990s retro aesthetic, but we see this in fashion as well, right? Like some of my undergrads dressed kind of like exactly how we dressed in the 90s, except they have, cell phones and some other accessories that are different, but fashion wise, it's pretty much a lot of 90s throwback stuff. So I think especially as web design and app design becomes more structured with design systems and with the quote unquote best practices, right? I think there's this retro aesthetic as a way of looking back at, say, the GeoCities era and things like that, and MySpace, right? When the web was just weirder and there was some room for quirkier expressions. And so I think there's definitely space for that as a reaction against this sort of hyper structured form of designing that's optimized and all of these sort of things.
Yeah, I get you totally. But you said something about this duality in education and in trends, and you touched the subject of fashion as well. And I just start to realize that even in fashion, we are just trying to reach more like real life beauty, real life look. And in my opinion, it's the reaction to the digitalization of the world, right? So
Yeah.
on one hand, we are like, everything is digital, but on the other hand, we just need it to be real, right?
Right.
it's going to be like really getting structured somehow in 2020s?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting observation there, Kat, in terms of this pendulum that we see, right? Of looking at Instagram, especially with just doing some ethnography on Instagram and seeing where some of these visual aesthetics are, how people are framing their photos and things like that. And it's almost because of the democratization of these tools, right? Of like these beauty filters and all of these things, Facetune, right? Because almost everyone has access to that now. It's almost had the pendulum swing the other way of like, well, okay, if everyone can be a digital beauty, then let's value, or people are valuing natural beauty more, right? And also this backlash against some stuff, like I was reading about these trends in South Korea where these influencers, on their equivalent of YouTube and these streaming sites are like taking off their makeup to kind of show a little bit like, yes, this is artifice, right? But that there's still the kind of natural authenticity behind it, which I think this is a term that's been going on as a trend for a while too, right? About authenticity and how you live your life. So it seems natural to see that reflected in the visual aesthetics as well.
Yeah, yeah, authenticity. I feel it. And I think there's something about communities around brands, around subjects, different subjects, which is also like it comes from the need of like this realness and human touch in our digitalized lives, right? Do you think
Sure.
this is like something that will be trending in 2020 as well, like community design communities, maybe?
Yeah, definitely. I think in both digital and physical and hybrid as well, or because it's easier than ever to start your own Slack group or Facebook group or whatever that is, and or even just on design Twitter, right? And connect with people that you've maybe never met in person around shared interests, often in terms of like having arguments with people online. But I think that's important as well, especially in a lot of design teams where you're so focused on producing and shipping and all of these sort of things, right? Where you're very much heads down a lot of the time. I think there's a need, I think also related to the rise in remote work, right? As more and more teams are remote, you don't have that same water cooler, coffee break kind of thing. So maybe we're looking for that outside of our immediate coworkers and immediate teams. And so people are also going to design events and meetups in their cities or even traveling to conferences and things like that. So I don't think that's going to change necessarily, but I think thinking about this hybrid kind of thing, right? Or you'll meet somebody online and then you'll meet them in person at a local event or at a national conference, and also vice versa, right? You're going to a conference, but then you have a back channel on Twitter or on a Slack group, and then that's a way of continuing the conversation. And that part is exciting, right? Because it's a great equalizer for people who maybe are less extroverted to just introduce themselves to somebody, but you can be like, okay, hey, I like your tweet. Let's meet up at the coffee break, right? So things like that, I think, are making these events and communities more inclusive, which I think is a good thing.
Okay, thank you. And my last question to you, because I know that you are with AIGA and we talked a little bit about communities. So I'm going to ask you about your personal, like maybe not personal, but career-wise,
Sure.
your plans or resolutions for 2020.
Yeah, so my resolutions for 2020, I mean, I mentioned this at the top of the interview, but uh, with AIGA, I'm producing and hosting a podcast called Design Future Now. And we are really looking at these conversations about designing the future and the future of design. And so my aspiration for that is to just build that out, bring in more diverse voices, maybe designers working in fields that are less obvious, right? Maybe not so consumer tech focused, um, in this broader sense. And also bringing in maybe voices that are less represented and heard. I think my other aspiration kind of personally in my own work and my own practice is getting more into other forms of storytelling in film, right? Whether it's exploring and playing with VR, AR kind of storytelling, or even just working in traditional film and video, which I had a background in back in the day and kind of moved away from. But I think as I'm getting older, it's kind of a return to roots in a way, right? I'm actually just helped a friend with designing the credit sequence for his movie. And so things like that, where I can take my design skills and my creative skills and bring it into some of these other media as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lee, for your insights and for your opinions. I hope all your goals are going to be met in 2020. And thank you very much. And let's keep in touch.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Kat. This was fun. Hope it's of interest and of use for your community.